Okay, I'm gonna be real with y'all. This video is like 60% pure brain rot, so buckle up, buttercups, we've got some lore to explore. Before I launch into this doozy of a conversation, a quick heads up. You should be caught up on all of Sumeru's archon quests, the last of which was King Deshret and the Three Magi. If you have not done this, don't watch this video. Now with that out of the way, let's get into the nitty gritty. There's been a lot of conversation about Rukkhadevata and Kusanali's relationship ever since Lost Legacies in the Sand came out, in which we see Rukkhadevata regressing into a child. Now, many believe this confirms the theory that Kusanali is just a depowered, memoryless Rukkhadevata, and this perception is understandable to a certain extent. It's exceedingly clear that Kusanali and Rukkhadevata share a lot of physical similarities. However, I don't agree with the hive mind's consensus. This scene isn't what you think it is. That's not Rukkhadevata becoming Kusanali, and also, Rukkhadevata and Kusanali aren't the same person. Now, before you grab your pitchforks, because I imagine some of y'all are probably ready to skewer me alive in the comments, hold your horses for a sec, my precious little veg heads, and allow me to present my case. The big reason why I just don't buy that this scene is Rukkhadevata becoming Kusanali is the timeline. It just ain't adding up, and there's no way around it. We've been told on more than one occasion and by different characters, including Kusanali herself, that Rukkhadevata disappeared and died after the cataclysm 500 years ago. Kusanali was born and found by the sages of the academia shortly after. This is where we have a bit of a problem. Kusanali and other sources as well confirm the Scarlet King died long before the cataclysm. The fall of his kingdom happened because of the forbidden knowledge he brought into the world, and the forbidden knowledge is the only reason the withering and the disease Elazar exist in Sumeru. According to Tignari, the withering has been documented in Sumeru for millennia. In other words, for thousands of years. Since Lost Legacies in the Sand is telling us the story of its appearance, these events must have happened long before the cataclysm. Also, keep in mind, this story is narrated by Kasala, one of the Scarlet King's priests. This guy was alive to witness all of these events himself. He must have also been there when Rukkhadevata regressed into a child. Not to mention, we actually have some idea of Rukkhadevata's actions during the cataclysm thanks to the book The Folio of Foliage. We'll be going into this book later in the video, but all you need to know right now is that what it describes is completely different than what we see in Lost Legacies in the Sand. But regardless, the Scarlet King's downfall and the cataclysm are two different events separated by vast amounts of time. My guess is that Rukkhadevata regressed immediately after putting her power into these 7 temples. The Scarlet King then chose to sacrifice himself after these temples were unable to completely get rid of the problem. This would mean Rukkhadevata was already in the form of a child by the time Khaenri'ah was steamrolled. And if Kusanali really is only 500 years old, this can't be the moment she was born. So let me ask you a little question. Why do Sumeru's statues of the 7 look like a child? Why don't they look like Rukkhadevata's original form? Technically, we don't know if the statues are supposed to reflect the original archon or the one currently in power, but we do know these things couldn't have existed until after the Archon War, because the 7 archons weren't a thing until after that point. So I'd like to suggest this. While the real reasons for the Archon War haven't been confirmed yet, it seems like Celestia was intent on making sure there was only one god per region in Teyvat. Any god that didn't ascend as one of the 7 was either sealed away, fled to the Dark Sea, relinquished their power into the land, which made them lose their original forms, like what happened to Guoba and Andrias, or they were just straight up killed. Now, Sumeru had 3 gods of wisdom in the past that we know of: the goddess of flowers, the Scarlet King, and Greater Lord Rukkhadevata. I would imagine all of them had to participate in the Archon War, so while they were friends, they would inevitably have to come in conflict with each other, or 2 of them would have to submit, which possibly means a loss of form and power for the losers. The goddess of flowers died somehow first, we don't know quite how that happened, and then the Scarlet King ended up sacrificing himself to clean up his own mess and heal the land. With no other gods that we know of in the region, perhaps this was the moment Rukkhadevata was able to ascend as the official Dendro archon. That means by the time the Archon War ended, she was already child Rukkhadevata since she exhausted her strength helping out the Scarlet King, and that's why the statues of the Seven look the way they do. They're not in the image of Kusanali, they're child Rukkhadevata. I mean, the body proportions match a lot more compared to Kusanali anyway, and also, let's assume for a moment the statues of the Seven are built by the people and not Celestia. Do you really think the Academia would make a statue in the image of Kusanali, a god they hate? I don't think so. Okay. I can hear you now, but Onion, it's so obvious Rukkhadevata and Kusanali are the same person. Even if this wasn't the moment Kusanali was born, there's no denying they look incredibly similar. They have to be the same person, and I disagree. And the game does too. You could argue that someone somewhere at some point in the story lied to us about Rukkhadevata and the circumstances of Kusanali's birth, and that Kusanali doesn't remember who she once was, but I don't think that's what's going on here. So what gives? Why is Rukkhadevata considered dead? And why isn't Kusanali Rukkhadevata? I'd like to bring up a quote I've mentioned in some of my videos before, said by the Kitsune Saigu. Losing one's memory is no different from losing one's life. It is like death amidst darkness eternal. In other words, memory loss is equivalent to death in the world of Tevat. Even the Aranara believe this. It's not really surprising given how important memories seem to be in this world. This might be why everybody and their mother is saying Rukkhadevata is dead. It's because she is. If she regressed to a small child during the Archon War, she must have retained most of her memories and wisdom, or enough of each to still guide her people well. I mean, if you think about it, Kasala doesn't mention that Rukkhadevata lost her memories, just her strength and original form. Maybe that's why her followers accepted her at the time. She was still Rukkhadevata, so when the Cataclysm rolled around and Kusanali popped up without a single memory or even an ounce of wisdom Rukkhadevata had, the Academia was probably disappointed. We know they expected her to have the same level of wisdom as her predecessor, but she didn't. So how could they, the nation that prides itself on knowledge and wisdom, have a god that lacked both? It must have been infuriating. Even though this new god resembled theirs, there was no mistaking that Rukkhadevata was dead. There was nothing left of her, and whatever stood before them was definitely not her, just a cheap imitation. Maybe that's part of the reason why they want to build their own god, one that can rival their greater lord, Rukkhadevata. Despite saying all of this, however, I don't think this mystery is as simple as Rukkhadevata lost her memory and is now living a different life as Kusanali. I think there's an extra layer to this story, and it's got something to do with a certain god of time. I'd like to bring up this video that contained my initial thoughts about Rukkhadevata and Kusanali, and how their relationship would parallel with the parable of the tree from the book Before Sun and Moon. Ignoring the details from the parable that are unimportant right now, Istaroth, the god of time, was basically able to take the branches of a tree that was going to be cut down in order to regrow the tree, and the tree spirit of the new tree was a continuation of the past one. This is very similar to taking a healthy branch of a tree and planting it to make a clone of the tree. Except in this case, a god of timey-wimey bullshit is involved to speed up the process, and she's making baby gods. This theory is a lot more substantial now that Sumeru's out. The Marinara, Aranara, I've messed up on that like 3 different times. The Aranara suggested that Rukkhadevata went somewhere to become a tree and bear fruit, not unlike how the Aranara became Ashvata trees. Ashvata trees are sacred fig trees in Hinduism, and their equivalents in Buddhism are Bodhi trees, which I talk about at length in this video, specifically about a Bodhi tree in the Mahabodhi temple in Bihar, India, that has a history of being destroyed, but a new one always grew in its place every time it was. In this case, Rukkhadevata is like the original Bodhi tree and Kusanali is the new one. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the folio of foliage tells us Rukkhadevata became a tree. It says she descended to the heart of the land, which could either be Sumeru or Tevat itself, and became what's called the Gaukarena. This is a mythical plant from pre-Islamic Persian and Zoroastrian myth that can provide immortality to resurrected bodies of the dead. It's extremely similar to the concept of the tree of life present in the Abrahamic religions. It basically tree is a world tree. Now, the world tree in Genshin is the Irminsul tree, so my guess is we saw Rukkhadevata the moment we set foot in Sumeru. She became this specific Irminsul, because remember, there are different ones in the game, or if this is the actual big Irminsul tree, you know, the one that probably stretches around the world that all the other Irminsul trees are just like parts of, then she just joined with the tree to heal the land, possibly the world. That's probably why her consciousness is tied to the tree in the first place. Also, this place matches what's described in the Folio of Foliage, a dark place deep within the earth. It's even got all those sustainer cubes and crimson corruptedness floating around that we know is associated with the cataclysm. So let's say Rukkhadevata did become this Irminsul, or a part of it, and someone like Istaroth stepped in to facilitate Kusanali's birth. Instead of Istaroth providing the seed to grow a tree, she took pieces of an existing tree and grew a whole new tree from it instead. Or in other words, used bits of Rukkhadevata to create Kusanali. If this is true, then it's more accurate to say Rukkhadevata is Kusanali's source material, but they're not quite the same. Kusanali is a clone. This would be the exact same type of relationship their Genshin Impact counterparts have. Teresa is a clone of Colin, but that doesn't make her Colin, as Otto found out. They're not the same people. At any rate, I'm firmly convinced that Istaroth did have something to do with Kusanali's birth because, well, I was trying really freaking hard to not make this a Sun and Moon entry, but it's unavoidable at this point, so here goes nothing. Welcome to part 1.9 of my Sun and Moon series. Will we ever get to part 2? Who knows at this point? No. Anyway, one of my biggest questions since hauling ass to Sumeru is whether or not Rukkhadevata and Kusanali have connections to the Moon Sisters, Arya, Sonnet, and Canon. This, of course, includes Istaroth, because I really do think she is one of the sisters. Throughout my Sun and Moon series, I have speculated about the sisters and Istaroth's relationship with the Irminsul tree, that they are the guardians of it, or even the tree itself. This is especially true for Istaroth because having access to this tree and the ley lines would make a lot of things about Istaroth suddenly make sense, like how she's a god of time, for example. The ley lines, which are the roots of the Irminsul tree, contain the flow of time itself, or in other words, the memories of the world, which is basically the timeline of the world. So Istaroth having some measure of control over the ley lines, and therefore the Irminsul tree itself, would make sense. And if my other theory about Tevat being a domain of consciousness with Istaroth as its current controller holds up to be true in any way, shape, or form, then her being the Irminsul tree, which is like the heart and brain of Tevat, makes sense too. There are also weird moon associations with the Irminsul. Just check out these videos if you want more context. Now, since Sumeru's plot is incredibly tied to the Irminsul, I thought maybe Rukkhadevata and Kusanali would have ties with Istaroth and the moon, and it turns out they definitely do. In fact, I think Rukkhadevata and Kusanali are both parallels to Istaroth. This rabbit hole goes real deep, so wake the f up and get all that sweet brain juice flowing. There's a lot we have to cover. First of all, Kusanali called herself the moon, not just once, but several times. A lot of people didn't take this literally, but of course, me being me, I thought there was more to it. And yeah, there is. Now, Nahida is the name Kusanali goes by, right? Well, Nahida, or Nahid, is one of the names for an ancient Iranian goddess of waters named Anahita. She's associated with healing and wisdom and fertility. At some point way back in the day, she became conflated with a certain Mesopotamian goddess and gained a lot of the same traits as said goddess, like an association to war and to the morning star, Venus. That goddess's name is Ishtar, whose Sumerian name is Inanna. Now, I talked at length about these goddesses in part 1.5 of my Sun and Moon series because they were conflated with the goddess Astarti, who the demon Astaroth gets its name from. And Astaroth is where the name Istaroth comes from. So, Kusanali having the name of a goddess that was conflated with the goddesses Istaroth is likely based on is suspicious. Also, one of the symbols for the goddess Anahita is the lotus flower. And so far, there are 2 species of lotus flower native to Sumeru. One is the Kalpalata lotus, one of the most annoying materials to find in the game aside from that which shall not be named. The interesting thing about this lotus is that it's actually not a lotus flower, it just looks like one. In fact, there are a lot of plants in Sumeru that are classified as something they're not, like the Sumeru rose. It isn't actually a rose, but they call it one anyway. What if this was a hint at Rukkhadevata and Kusanali's relationship? That Kusanali only looks like Rukkhadevata but isn't the same as her? Well, the second lotus flower is the Nilotpala lotus, and this one is the important one. According to the stories of the Aranara, a long time ago, when the Moon Sisters were still alive and not trying to murder each other allegedly, the sisters had nightly strolls in the desert, and Nilotpala lotuses would bloom at their feet, hence why another name for these flowers is the lunar lotus. This wouldn't be anything special if it weren't for the fact that according to the folio of foliage, Nilotpala lotuses bloomed at Rukkhadevata's feet when she was fighting the forces of the abyss during the cataclysm. And guess how many did? 1,000. You know, a number that's near and dear to Istaroth, since she's called the 1,000 Winds of Time. Oh, but the suspicions do not stop there, especially when it comes to Rukkhadevata's parallels with Istaroth. So there's this book called Scroll of Streaming Song, which is heavily implied to be describing the first meeting between the goddess of flowers and Rukkhadevata. And the way that Rukkhadevata introduces herself is really suspicious. She says, "I am the owner of yesterday and the master of tomorrow morning." Another way you could phrase this is, "I am the owner of the past and the master of the future?" No matter how you look at it, this is a weird reference to time. Does anyone find it odd that Rukkhadevata would have moonflowers blooming at her feet in a similar way that the Moon Sisters did? Not to mention the number of them is 1,000, a number Istaroth is associated with, and on top of that, there's weird time references in regard to her, at least in this one case. It's weird. Rukkhadevata is even described in the folio foliage in a similar way Istaroth is by the Enconomians in Before Sun and Moon. In both cases, each of the people writing about these goddesses were reluctant to use their real names. Rukkhadevata was also described as having an all-pervading and indestructible will once she became the tree. All-pervading meaning having an effect on everything and everyone. I mean, the book says she became the earth itself, and plants and spiritual knowledge were her undying will. So, if you want to stretch it out a little further, she's omnipresent to a certain degree, and omniscient. Kusanali actually described her as the latter. Istaroth is also described in a similar way, kind of. The Enconomians referred to her as every moment, every flash of delirium, the ruler of the unchanging world. It really makes her seem like the higher power that A describes her as. Time itself is also described in an all-pervading and indestructible way in the world of Tevat. No one can escape time, not even the gods. We're gonna return to this conversation about Istaroth and Rukkhadevata being omnipresent, omniscient, etc., so keep this in the back of your brain. One more thing about the Nilotpala lotus. The Japanese name for it is Somalata, which means moon plant in Sanskrit. It's used to create the mythical elixir Soma, a sacred drink that has healing properties and grants immortality. It's something only reserved for the gods in Hindu mythology, and I'll give you a wild guess as to where this thing was stored. On the moon. In fact, the name Soma happens to be one of the names of the Hindu god of the moon. Now here's where things get real spicy. The equivalent of the Somalata plant in pre-Islamic Persian and Zoroastrian myth is the Homa plant. It has the same kind of attributes, makes the same kind of divine elixir, etc. The Gaokarena, you know, the world tree that Rukkhadevata becomes according to the folio foliage, is a type of Homa plant. It's even called the white Homa. If the Gaokarena truly is supposed to be the Urban tree in Genshin, and really think it is, then that would be yet another implied connection the tree has to the moon, and therefore a connection Rukkhadevata, and by extension Kusanali, have to the moon as well. And that's not all. Homa is also a god that is the personification of the divine plant. He's the reason the plant has its potency. And he was associated with Nahida. He was also considered to be the priest of Ahura Mazda, the main creator deity of Zoroastrianism. You can consider the primordial one to be Genshin's Ahura Mazda. Now here's the kicker. Not only is Kusanali's constellation, Sapientia Oromazdis, a reference to Ahura Mazda, since it literally translates to the wisdom of Oromazdis, Oromazdis being one of Ahura Mazda's titles, but Istaroth was called the primordial one's priest in Before Sun and Moon. So, Istaroth would be the Homa of Genshin, along with Kusanali and by extension Rukkhadevata, if these parallels ring true. Okay, I promise, one more little leap into the sea of brain rot. Homa is really similar to the word Homa, right? Homa happens to be a type of mythical bird from ancient Iranian legends. It is compassionate, blessing those who it or its shadow touches with help and good fortune. It flies high in the heavens, unseen by all, and in some cases is said to never set foot on the ground. It also burns itself after a few hundred years and is reborn from its own ashes like a phoenix. But you know what the Homa bird really reminds me of? Mona's story from the Golden Apple Archipelago. It was about a transparent bird that always sang, but mortals couldn't see or hear it. It was born in wisdom and trapped in ignorance, becoming a star in the night sky to guide those who could see it. It bears similarities to the Homa bird, and also to Rukkhadevata and Kusanali. Rukkhadevata is described in the Folio of Foliage in a similar way to this bird. The book says many people had never before heard her voice, or if they had, they did not know it was her. And we already know the selfless sacrifice she made for her friend, the Scarlet King and his people. So she's got the compassionate and magnanimous part down of the Homa bird. And from the very beginning, Kusanali has been called a caged bird. She's locked away in her sanctuary, ignored by the majority of her people, yet she still anonymously helps when she can, like when she comforted Dunyarzad as a child and saved her life later, and when she eased the minds of the exiled researchers who had their brain juice sapped by the academia, and imparting her power upon them would save Aru Village and the Traveler and his friends. The Dendro Archons are truly like Homa birds, and I think Istaroth is too. In fact, the bird from Mona's story also fits Istaroth perfectly. The association to music and fate makes for a perfect parallel to the Moon Sisters, who are all about music and possibly fate. I've also likened the Moon Sisters to doves before, calling them the doves who held branches of the Irminsul tree. Check out part 1.5 of Sun and Moon for more context on that. The world is also represented as a clock in this animation, which is suspicious, and the star the bird turns into happens to be the 8-pointed star, a symbol we've seen a lot in Genshin that also happens to be the symbol the Enkanomians used to represent Istaroth. Speaking of Genshin Atlantis, Istaroth helped them out in their time of need. She seems to be known in a lot of places all over Teyvat as well, so I wonder if she's helped other fallen civilizations too. In fact, I think she's helped a lot of humans reach their potential in a very important way that we'll discuss in another video. But even though we see evidence of her existence in so many different places in Teyvat, we haven't seen her once. Perhaps she truly is the Homa bird of Genshin Impact, the transparent, unseen bird that always sings, guiding people through the night and to their destinies. One more thing about Homa. You've definitely heard this word before, most notably from the Staff of Homa. You know, the shape of this staff is something most players have also seen multiple times at this point. The icon for the Battle Pass is shaped like this. The Aranara have an emblem shaped like this. In fact, a lot of things related to the Aranara are shaped like the Homa symbol. But you know what else is? The wings on the statue of the omnipresent god. Now, I and some other people in the community as well have thought for a very long time this statue represents Istaroth. Istaroth might be omnipresent, especially if she has access to the Irminsul tree, which connects the entire world together. The statue looks like the blessing of the Welkin moon, and Istaroth might be a moon sister, yada yada yada. So if this really is Istaroth, that's really suspicious, because this statue is all I could think about while playing through Sumeru, and it's not just because the Homa symbol pops up repeatedly. This statue is based on the 1,000-armed, 100-eyed Buddhist deity Bodhisattva known as Kannon in Japanese. I actually talked about them a long time ago in this video. They are known for their compassion and mercy, just like a Homa bird. Kannon delayed their own Buddhahood in order to help free humans from samsara, the cycle of death and rebirth, and they worked tirelessly to do so. Samsara was a word thrown around a lot in the first 2 acts of Sumeru's Archon quests. The academia trapped Sumeru City in a never-ending dream samsara, and the one that was tirelessly working to free everyone trapped in it, aside from the Traveler and Paimon, was Kusanali, the selfless girl that worked to keep Dunyarzad alive for who knows how many cycles. The girl who has constantly called herself the moon. She's like the Kannon of Sumeru, and if this statue, which is based on Kannon, really is supposed to be Istaroth, then there's yet another potential connection between our Dendro Archons, the moon, and the god of time. I truly think they parallel each other well. With that being said, I talk a lot about frame stories, and I believe Sumeru's entire storyline is one. I believe that it is telling us more than just the tragedy of Rukkhadevata and the caged bird Kusanali. Perhaps it is truly telling us about the plight of the world itself and the unseen god of time. Perhaps Istaroth is locked away somewhere, unable to escape, which is why we haven't seen her. If that's the case, if Rukkhadevata and Kusanali are playing the role of Istaroth in this frame story, who do you think plays the role of the academia? Who might be keeping Istaroth locked away? I think you know the answer. You know, now that I think about it, this scene reminds me of a certain scene from the Genshin comic pertaining to Celestia. Funny, the coloring here is the exact same. I want to leave you with one last thought, just something to ponder. If I were you, I'd pay attention to Rukkhadevata and Kusanali's story, because I think it can teach us a lot about a certain annoying Navi who is childlike, has lost her memories, and seemingly has a lot to do with the moon. Thanks for watching if you made it this far. Happy Halloween. Enjoy version 3.2, and I'll see you guys on the other side of the moon.